Policemen tossed a black boy right in front of his father, but what they didn't know, is that the father was a legendary Special Forces operative, and what happened next shocked an entire city. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday. The sun was still climbing when the water hose clicked on and the sound of laughter bounced off the sidewalk. A father and son, barefoot and shirtless under the heat, were washing down their car right in front of their home. No shouting, no loud music, no crowd. Just a peaceful morning in their own driveway, in a neighborhood that barely even acknowledged their existence. Until a police cruiser rolled by, then another. Until those same officers stepped out with hands already resting on tasers, their eyes scanning the scene not for threat, but for skin tone. Until what was a simple father-son bonding moment turned into a battlefield of humiliation. One officer stepped forward, the badge on his chest catching the sun. "Step away from the car," he said, voice sharp, aggressive, completely detached. The father turned, water dripping from the rag in his hand, brows pulled in confusion. "Officer, this is my property." I said step away from the vehicle," the second officer barked, louder, pulling his taser. "Don't talk back, boy." That word. Boy. A knife masked as a word. Directed not at the child, but at the man standing tall beside him. The son looked up, frozen, still holding the sponge. He was 13. Maybe 14. Just a kid. His mouth opened slightly. "Dad," he whispered. He didn't get the answer. Just a flash. A crackling sound. A jolt. The boy collapsed. A scream tore through the quiet morning, not just the sound of a taser discharge, but of something deeper. Something breaking inside a father. His knees hit the ground beside his son's body. Shaking. Eyes rolled back. Hands twitching. The officers didn't flinch. They stood there like statues, as if they hadn't just electrocuted a child. As if they hadn't just spat in the face of every ounce of dignity that man had built across decades of life. He begged them to stop. Voice trembling. Arms outstretched. "Please, please, he didn't do anything, he's just a kid," but they cuffed him. Pushed his face against his own car. The water still running. The soap dripping off the hood. The boy lying motionless 5 feet away. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was who that man truly was. Not just a father. Not just a homeowner. Not just another black man to be subdued. He had fought in wars they'd only read about. Had taken down enemies in silence, crossed borders no map could show, and led elite units through operations so classified they didn't exist on paper. He was a legend in circles where legends rarely lasted. A ghost in the records. And yet, right there, on his own street, none of that mattered. His skin was the only detail they needed to decide who he was. The humiliation wasn't just in the arrest. It was in the silence from neighbors who peeked through blinds and closed them when his eyes met theirs. It was in the smirk one officer gave while shoving him into the squad car. It was in the whisper of a voice on the police radio saying, "We'll log it as resisting. He's got an attitude." It was in the moment they drove off, leaving a boy in an ambulance and a father cuffed with no answers. That day, they didn't just tase a boy. They sparked something they couldn't control. Because humiliation does something to a man. Especially a man trained to endure the worst, and come back sharper. And this wasn't the battlefield anymore. This was personal. This was home. And it wasn't going to end in silence. The department thought they could bury the body cam footage. Thought they could write up a few words, spin a story, call it protocol. They didn't know he had already started documenting everything. Every word. Every second. They didn't know he had friends in places they couldn't touch, friends who owed him favors from missions that never made the news. Men in suits. Women in offices behind soundproof doors. People who still picked up the phone when he called. They didn't know he would take the fight beyond City Hall, past local press, straight to federal agencies that could turn corrupt officers into prisoners faster than they could say, "I feared for my life." They didn't know that 2 weeks after the incident, the same officers would be sitting across a table, staring into the eyes of federal prosecutors, trying to explain why they discharged a weapon on a minor who was unarmed, nonviolent, and in front of his own house. They didn't know that those questions wouldn't come from journalists, but from former military interrogators. And still, what hit them hardest wasn't the exposure. It wasn't even the charges. It was the truth of who they had messed with. The day they humiliated that man, they didn't just brutalize a father, they activated a force they had no idea how to contain. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he demanded justice. And he knew exactly how to get it, legally, surgically, and completely within the system they thought belonged to them. He didn't need to throw a punch. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just had to open the right doors. Doors they'd spent their lives pretending didn't exist. And when he did, when the hearing started, when the footage was leaked, when the testimonies rolled in, the city trembled. But it wasn't about reputation. It wasn't about pride. It was about one thing, and one thing only, the image of his son on the ground, his body convulsing, eyes wide, not from pain, but from betrayal. That image burned deeper than any scar from the battlefield. And he was never going to let that be the final image of who they were. The case would go to trial. Not in a civilian court, but in a military tribunal with federal oversight. The officers' past actions would come to light. Patterns of behavior. Prior complaints. Racial bias. Leaked audio tapes. Internal memos. Secrets they thought were buried. And every single one of them would come back to haunt them, all because they chose the wrong driveway, the wrong boy, the wrong man. But there's still something nobody knows, not even the city that watched it all unfold. Not the lawyers, not the journalists, not even the other officers. Something buried even deeper than the man's military record. Something that happened the moment he looked down at his son on the pavement and realized this fight wasn't just about justice. It was about something far more powerful. And once you find out what that is, you'll understand why this story doesn't just end with punishment. It ends with something unforgettable. So here's the question, what did the father do that changed everything? Stay until the end. You won't believe it. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. At Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism in any form. Our stories exist to shed light on injustice and to inspire strength through truth, dignity, and powerful comebacks. This story is for you. Enjoy, and if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that matter. The street was quiet. A wide stretch of cracked pavement, lined with aging trees and single-story homes that had stood long enough to bear the weight of generational stories. It was in one of these houses, slightly tucked behind an overgrown bush and a rusted mailbox that leaned a few inches too far to the right, where Marcus lived with his son. Augusta, Georgia wasn't exactly the kind of place where stories like his got told. It was a city that smiled on the surface, but carried shadows under its skin. A place where the front lawns looked calm, but behind closed doors, entire lives were unfolding, some silently, some explosively. For Marcus, it was a town big enough to disappear in, but small enough that people always noticed when you didn't fit the mold. And Marcus never fit the mold. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. There was a calmness in the way he moved, a discipline that made people wonder if he had some sort of military background, and they'd be right, though they'd never guess how deep that background ran. He walked like a man who had seen things and survived them. A man who no longer reacted to small provocations because he had once lived where only the big ones mattered. The only time his eyes truly softened was when he looked at his son. Malik. 13 years old, all elbows and knees, growing into his body faster than he knew how to manage, and smart in ways Marcus hadn't expected. Curious, thoughtful, a little awkward, and fiercely kind, Malik was the kind of kid who still believed the world could be fair, still trusted strangers, still tried to make sense of things by asking the right questions. It was the kind of innocence Marcus had gone to war to protect, and now fought every day to preserve. Their house wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a tired kitchen, and a living room with more memories than furniture. But it was theirs. Bought in cash when Marcus left the service, after years of floating between cities, jobs, and hotel rooms that smelled of bleach and stale air. This house had no luxury, but it had roots. The driveway was cracked, the porch light flickered when it rained, and the grass had a stubborn habit of growing unevenly, but inside, it was a safe place. Marcus had spent years building a quiet life for Malik, the kind of life that had nothing to do with his past and everything to do with his son's future. He woke up early every morning, not out of habit, but necessity. He cooked breakfast while Malik got dressed for school, packed his own lunch, made sure the boy had his backpack ready, shoes tied, collar straight. They'd talk briefly, sometimes about history, sometimes about music, sometimes about girls, though that topic always made Malik roll his eyes. Then Marcus would walk him to the corner, watch him get on the bus, and only then exhale. He worked at a small mechanic shop a few miles away. Not because he had to, his military pension could have covered more, but because he liked fixing things. Machines made sense. Unlike people, they broke in predictable ways. He came home by 4, made dinner, helped with homework, and on weekends, if the weather was good, they'd wash the car together. It was their ritual. Not about cleanliness. About connection. It was on one of those weekends, the kind where the air felt heavier and the sun took its time rising, that everything began to change. That morning, Marcus had gotten up before Malik. The air smelled like cut grass and damp concrete. He poured himself coffee, stood by the window, and watched the street slowly wake up. It was a peaceful moment, one of many he'd learned to appreciate after years of living in places where peace was a luxury. Malik joined him a bit later, hair still wild from sleep, rubbing his eyes, asking if they could wash the car today. Marcus smiled. Said sure. Told him to grab the bucket. The driveway was half shaded by the old oak tree out front. Birds chirped above them. They joked, laughed, played music low from Marcus's phone. Nothing loud. Nothing aggressive. Just a father and son, cleaning up their old Honda, spraying each other with water, sharing a few hours that felt like they belonged to nobody else. Marcus had even begun teaching Malik how to properly wax the hood, something he claimed was an art form, not a task. Malik rolled his eyes and said, "Okay, Mr. Miyagi." They both laughed. A few houses down, someone watched. An older white woman who'd recently moved in. She never waved when Marcus passed. Never looked directly at him. Her eyes darted to the boy, lingered just long enough to be uncomfortable. She made a phone call. Told dispatch she saw 2 men messing with a car in her neighborhood. Said she didn't recognize them. Said she felt uneasy. That was all it took. When the first police cruiser pulled up, Marcus didn't flinch. He wiped his hands on a rag, turned down the music, and motioned for Malik to keep rinsing the back tires. The officers stepped out. Young. Pale. Hands twitchy. Marcus didn't recognize them, must have been new to the district. One of them walked straight toward Marcus. The other kept a hand near his belt. "Sir, is this your car?" one of them asked, not as a question, but a challenge. Marcus nodded. "Yes, officer. It's parked in my driveway. My son and I are just washing it." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Got ID on you?" "Inside the house," Marcus replied evenly. "I can go get it if you'd like." "Not if I tell you to stay put." Something shifted. The energy in the air went from curious to hostile. Marcus took a deep breath. "With respect, I haven't done anything wrong. This is my property, my vehicle, my son. We're just cleaning, the second officer stepped forward now, voice louder. Step away from the car. Both of you. Hands where I can see them. Malik froze. The sponge slipped from his hand. The water still ran. The moment stretched like elastic. Marcus kept his voice steady. Officer, my son is only 13. He doesn't understand what's happening. Please, don't escalate, back up. Now. The taser was drawn. And that was the moment. The fracture. The crack in the mirror. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. Marcus raised his arms, moved slowly, trying to position himself between the weapon and his child. But he wasn't fast enough. The officer aimed. Fired. The sound tore through the morning air, followed by Malik's scream as his small body convulsed and hit the ground. Neighbors came out. Some shouted. Most just stared. Marcus dropped to his knees, calling his son's name, trying to shield him, only to be yanked back by force. His face pressed into the hood of the same car he'd been cleaning minutes earlier. Malik's limbs twitched. His eyes rolled. His breath came in gasps. They called it a misunderstanding in the report. Said the father was uncooperative. Claimed the boy reached for something suspicious. No charges were filed. No apologies were made. No justice was given. But something had broken inside Marcus that day. Something quiet, cold, deliberate. Not rage. Not fury. Just clarity. A return of a version of himself that he'd buried long ago. A version that remembered how to infiltrate, how to dismantle, how to work within the seams of systems and find the exact thread to pull until the whole thing unraveled. He didn't say a word to the officers. Didn't scream. Didn't threaten. He just watched. Memorized. Calculated. He knew better than anyone how institutions operated. How the chain of command protected its own. How evidence could vanish. How narratives could shift. He also knew how to beat them at their own game. And that's where the story truly begins. With a father on his knees beside his son, blood roaring in his ears, humiliation thick on his skin, and a decision blooming in his chest. He wouldn't fight them in the streets. He wouldn't fight them in the press. He would fight them where it mattered. Where they never expected him to be waiting. Where silence became strategy. And justice, a weapon. Because this time, they picked the wrong father. The hospital room was cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that didn't just settle on your skin but burrowed deeper, into your chest, into your breath. Marcus sat by Malik's bedside, one hand resting on his son's, the other clenched into a fist on his thigh. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady, but every sound in the room felt louder than it should have. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional wheeze of the air vent, the quiet murmurs of nurses outside the door. Malik was still, his small body swaddled in white sheets, a single fore feeding into the vein at his arm. His eyes fluttered occasionally, not fully conscious, not fully asleep. It was the look of someone who had been yanked into trauma and hadn't yet found their way back. Marcus hadn't left his side. Not for food. Not for rest. He sat through every hour, through every nurse check, through every mechanical beep that reminded him his son was still fighting. Not just physically, but mentally. Because even as the doctors told him Malik would recover, Marcus knew some wounds didn't show up on X-rays. Some didn't bruise the skin, they bruised belief, safety, identity. And those wounds? They didn't heal with time. They healed with truth. With justice. With action. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A nurse peeked in, her eyes gentle but wary. "There's someone here to see you," she said, voice lowered. "He says he's a detective. Internal affairs." Marcus didn't speak. He looked down at his son's hand, gave it a soft squeeze, then stood and followed the nurse out. In the hallway, a man in plain clothes waited. Mid-40s, stocky, with thinning hair and a badge clipped discreetly to his belt. He extended a hand. Detective Hanley. I'm assigned to review the incident on behalf of the department. Marcus stared at the hand but didn't take it. I've seen your file, Hanley continued. You're former military, right? Special Forces? Marcus didn't reply. He waited. The detective cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. Look, I'm not here to make excuses. What happened was bad. Real bad. But we have procedures, and before anyone gets disciplined, we need facts. Statements. Chain of events. All I'm asking is that you give me your side of the story. Marcus's voice, when it finally came, was low. Controlled. You'll get it in writing. Through a lawyer. I won't be answering any questions without counsel present. Hanley blinked. That's your right, of course. Just, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Staying calm. That'll help your case. Marcus looked him dead in the eyes. This isn't a case. This is my son. Then he turned and walked back into the room. Days passed. Malik was released with limited mobility, his muscles still stiff from the shock. Marcus installed extra locks on the doors, cameras around the perimeter. Not out of paranoia, out of preparation. His routines changed. He no longer walked Malik to the bus stop. He drove him directly to school. He no longer worked extra hours at the shop. He spent evenings researching legal options, making calls, contacting old friends, not civilian friends. People from the past. People whose names weren't in his phone but etched into memory. People who owed him favors. One of them was Trevor. They hadn't spoken in years, not since a joint op in Yemen went sideways and left half their unit scattered across enemy lines. Trevor had gotten out early, moved into law enforcement. Not small-town beat cop stuff, he worked for a federal intelligence wing that specialized in internal corruption and misconduct across military and police forces. When Marcus called, Trevor answered before the second ring. You sound different, Trevor said. Not angry. Just, focused. I need information, Marcus replied. I need to know who those officers are. Everything. Their records. Complaints. Disciplinary actions. Anything that's not public. That's a hell of a request. You still working deep? I am. But this isn't like before. I can't just hack into files and hand them over. Everything's traced now. I'd need a legal basis. You'll have one, Marcus said. I'm building a case. Quietly. But I need ammo. Trevor hesitated. Then said, give me 48 hours. While Trevor worked his side, Marcus met with a civil rights lawyer named Adrian. She was sharp, relentless, and had an office filled with framed headlines of high-profile lawsuits she'd won against police departments. She listened carefully as Marcus recounted everything, his tone never rising, his words precise. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said, they're going to push back hard. Say it was protocol. Say they felt threatened. I want federal jurisdiction, Marcus replied. She raised an eyebrow. That's difficult. Unless you can prove systemic misconduct, racial targeting, or a pattern of abuse, Marcus slid a flash drive across her desk. There's more coming. You'll have what you need. Outside the law firm, Marcus sat in his truck for a moment, hands on the wheel. He wasn't just navigating a legal battle. He was preparing for something bigger. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change. But to get it, he had to play the system from the inside, the same way it had played him. Trevor came through. 2 days later, he emailed a set of encrypted documents. Marcus read them carefully. Both officers had prior complaints. Use of force. Racial profiling. One had been suspended briefly 2 years ago after an incident involving a black teenager. The case had been sealed. The other had been involved in a lawsuit the city quietly settled. There were also emails. Internal ones. A chain of messages from their captain that revealed a pattern, code words, informal quotas, pressure to keep the neighborhood in check. It was enough to raise flags. Enough to file a federal motion. Adrienne's voice was calm but excited when she called. "This is gold," she said. "If we push this through the right channels, this case could shift jurisdiction. We could bring in DOJ oversight. Maybe even a tribunal, considering your military background." Marcus said nothing for a beat. Then asked, "What would that mean?" "It would mean they get investigated like soldiers, not cops. That their actions aren't just misconduct, they're violations under federal law. You said you didn't want revenge. This could be something bigger." The pressure grew. News of the incident began to spread. A cell phone video taken by a neighbor had gone viral. The footage didn't show the taser firing, but it showed the moment Malik dropped. The screams. The confusion. The voice of Marcus, raw with disbelief, calling his son's name. Interviews were requested. Marcus declined them all. Let Adrienne do the talking. Let the case build itself through documentation, not emotion. Meanwhile, Malik struggled. Nightmares kept him up. He flinched at loud sounds. He avoided looking at police cars. One evening, while they sat on the couch, he asked quietly, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" Marcus's heart cracked. "No," he said, voice soft but firm. "You did everything right. What happened wasn't your fault. It was theirs. Then why does it feel like it was mine?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He reached over, pulled Malik into a hug. "Because the world makes us carry things we didn't break. But that's not going to be your story. You hear me? You're not going to carry this alone." The court dates were set. The officers would be subpoenaed. The department had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming. The federal court accepted jurisdiction. What had once been a quiet local issue was now a high-profile civil rights case with national attention. But Marcus wasn't done. He was preparing something else. Something beyond legal strategy. Something only a man like him could design. He began meeting with people. Quietly. Strategically. A journalist who had once embedded with his unit during a peacekeeping mission in Sudan. A systems analyst who used to work cybersecurity for a government agency and now ran her own data consulting firm. A non-profit leader who focused on training black youth in constitutional rights and civic engagement. Each meeting added a piece to a puzzle only Marcus could see. A puzzle that would not only expose what happened, but dismantle the system that allowed it. He never raised his voice. Never made threats. But every move he made had precision. Every conversation was a step towards something inevitable. And as the court date approached, the city grew tense. The officers went silent. Their captain resigned unexpectedly. A leaked memo revealed that city officials had tried to suppress internal complaints for years. Then, one night, Marcus stood at Malik's bedroom door. The boy was finally sleeping peacefully. The moonlight cast a pale glow across the room. Marcus leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes heavy. And he whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "They thought they could bury us." What they didn't know, was that Marcus had already written the final move. And when the courtroom doors opened, what happened inside would change everything. The morning of the hearing arrived with a thick fog hanging over downtown Augusta, as if the city itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. The courthouse stood quiet, but the tension buzzing in the air around it felt louder than a riot. People gathered outside, some with signs, others with folded arms and skeptical eyes, all of them waiting for something bigger than a verdict. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it had become a reckoning. Inside, the courtroom filled slowly, a mix of lawyers, reporters, community leaders, and federal agents seated on benches that now felt too small for the weight they were about to carry. Every camera was turned on, every lens pointed at the defense table, but none of them could predict what Marcus had prepared. He entered quietly, wearing a dark suit, sharp but unassuming. Adrian walked beside him, flipping through a folder filled with sealed documents and indexed exhibits. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Marcus's presence said everything. Calm. Controlled. But something beneath the surface burned steady, not anger, not even rage, just resolve. Across the room, the two officers sat with their attorneys, stiff in posture, faces pale and tired. Their eyes flicked toward Marcus and then away. The air between them was thick. There was no smugness now. No smirks. No confidence. Just the quiet realization that whatever protection they once thought they had, might no longer apply. Judge Melton, a federal appointee known for his composure and sharp legal mind, took the bench. His gaze swept the courtroom with measured weight, his voice steady as he called the session to order. Today we are here to determine whether Officers Bennett and Sawyer violated federal civil rights protections under color of authority and if their conduct constitutes a pattern of abuse reflective of systemic malpractice within the Augusta Police Department. He paused, then turned toward the prosecution. Ms. Blake, you may proceed. Adrian stood, but instead of speaking, she walked to the side and turned on a projector. The first image appeared on the screen behind her, an internal email. Dated 6 months before the incident. Subject line, Neighborhood Presence. The text detailed informal quotas, racial profiling tactics encouraged through coded language, and performance reviews tied to high-visibility stops. Then another slide. A sealed disciplinary report from Officer Bennett's prior suspension, filed and buried by the department. Then another. A video. One none of the media had ever seen. The room went still. The footage began without warning, bodycam audio captured inside the patrol car before the taser incident. Bennett's voice was unmistakable. I've seen that black kid on this street before, always around that beat-up Honda. I bet that car's not even his. Sawyer chuckled. Let's make sure they know we're watching. People like that don't belong in neighborhoods like this. The recording cut off. Adrian looked around the courtroom, letting the silence land hard. This is not a single act of misconduct, she said, her voice clear. This is a pattern, sanctioned from the inside and protected from above. She walked back to the table and nodded toward Marcus. He stood slowly. The judge turned. You've requested to speak directly. Are you prepared to testify? Marcus nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom watched as he approached the stand, placed a hand on the Bible, and was sworn in. He sat with his back straight, his hands calm in his lap, eyes steady. Adrian began, her voice lower now, more intimate. Mr. Carter, can you tell the court what happened on the morning of July 6th, in your own words? He inhaled once. My son and I were washing our car in our driveway. Just the two of us. No music, no shouting. Just a father and a boy spending time together. They pulled up fast. No warning. No conversation. Just orders. They asked for ID. I said it was inside. I offered to get it. They told me not to move. I complied. Then they told us to back away. I tried to explain. And that's when it happened. They shot my son with a taser. A 13-year-old boy. On our property. For nothing. His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But the room felt like it tilted under the weight of his words. Adrian continued. Mr. Carter, are you a trained member of the United States military? Yes. What was your role? U.S. Army Special Forces. Operative class, classified tier. 12 years of active duty. Multiple tours. Would you say you were trained in identifying hostile behavior, threats, or dangerous individuals? Yes. Did you see any threat that day? No. Did your son make any aggressive moves? No. She paused, then took a step closer. Mr. Carter, why didn't you fight back that day? The room tensed. Marcus looked directly at her. Because I knew they wanted me to. His voice landed like a drop of iron. If I had raised my voice, I'd be a threat. If I had moved an inch, I'd be a statistic. If I had reached for my son, I'd be a name on a shirt. So I didn't fight back that day. But I never said I wouldn't fight. Adrienne's lips tightened into something between pride and pain. She turned toward the judge. Your Honor, we have filed for military tribunal review under Federal Violation Code 28.9.3. Invoking military intelligence resources to assess the officer's pattern of abuse as a national-level civil rights violation. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're invoking federal tribunal assessment. We are, sir, she said. We have documentation from a former federal intelligence agent corroborating the pattern. And we have support from 2 agencies willing to open joint investigation. This isn't just a local injustice. This is systemic. The courtroom exploded. The defense objected. The officer's attorneys stood, voices raised, arguing legality and protocol. But the judge was already leaning back, processing everything. He looked at Marcus. Did you supply intelligence evidence independently? I did, Marcus said. Through the proper chain. Quietly. Legally. And you believe this department's conduct qualifies as a threat to federal civil rights? I believe it's already cost us more than we know. The judge leaned forward. Then I'm granting review under federal scope. The words hit the room like thunder. The officers paled. One of them turned to his lawyer, whispering harshly. The other stared at Marcus like seeing him for the first time. But Marcus wasn't done. He stood again. I didn't come here to ruin lives. I came to protect mine. You humiliated me. You hurt my son. And for a long time, I thought the only way to fight back was through pain. But I know now that real power isn't in violence. It's in truth. And now the world sees it. The judge called for a recess, but the room didn't move. It was suspended in something electric. Something irreversible. The truth had been spoken. Evidence laid bare. And the system that had once felt untouchable was now shaking at the core. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged toward Adrienne. Protesters cheered. Supporters cried. But Marcus didn't stay. He walked down the steps with Malik at his side, the boy gripping his hand tightly, his face unsure, but his eyes proud. And somewhere inside the courthouse, in a sealed room with no cameras, federal agents were already preparing the next steps, the deeper investigation, the potential charges, the cascading fallout that no one could stop now. Because Marcus didn't just win a case. He opened a door. And what comes through that door next, will change everything. As the courthouse emptied out after the recess, the energy around Marcus shifted. No longer just a father in pursuit of justice, he had become the center of a movement he hadn't intended to ignite. Reporters waited outside like hawks, cameras aimed, microphones extended, asking for sound bites, reactions, declarations. But Marcus wasn't performing. He had no appetite for spectacle. He wasn't here to feed headlines, he was here to hold a broken system accountable. And yet, as he and Malik moved through the sea of people, his silence spoke louder than any podium ever could. They walked to a nearby room, private, closed off, shielded from the noise. Adrienne was already there, leaning against the table with a tablet in hand, her brows furrowed as she read incoming notifications. When Marcus entered, she looked up, her eyes tired but burning with purpose. She gestured toward the chair. They're scrambling, she said without preamble. The city council's calling emergency meetings. The DA's trying to get ahead of it. And Internal Affairs just launched a broader investigation on the entire district. They've officially lost control of the narrative. Marcus sat down slowly, stretching his hands over his knees. They never had it, he said calmly. They just convinced everyone they did. Adrian gave a small, dry laugh, then slid the tablet across the table. This is from your friend Trevor. He sent over the last package. Marcus stared at the screen. A list of names. Dates. Codes. Internal correspondence spanning over 4 years. Each item connected a thread, complaints buried, reports edited, officers transferred quietly, payouts made with hush agreements. But it wasn't just the officers on trial. It was the infrastructure around them. Supervisors. Commanders. Elected officials. All of them part of the same machine. Adrian leaned in. Marcus, this isn't just misconduct. This is cover-up. Systemic, deliberate, and sustained. We're not talking about 2 bad cops anymore. We're talking about a conspiracy to shield violence from exposure. Marcus didn't look away from the screen. So we take the whole thing down. Her voice lowered. Are you ready for that? Because once this goes public, you're not just a witness. You're a threat. They will come after you. They will paint you as unstable, vengeful, dangerous. They already did, Marcus said, finally meeting her eyes. But this time I have something they don't. What's that? Control. That night, Marcus sat in his living room with Malik, the lights dim, a bowl of untouched popcorn between them. A documentary played softly in the background, something about civil rights movements and landmark cases. Malik wasn't really watching. He kept glancing at his father, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. Did you ever think this would happen? That we'd be here? Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the question settle. I thought I left this kind of war behind, he said eventually. I thought the battlefield was somewhere far away. Turns out, it was always right here. Malik looked down. I still see it sometimes. That moment. The way they looked at me. Like I was less. Marcus reached over, his hand firm on Malik's shoulder. You are not less. You are never less. What they saw was their own ignorance. Their own fear. But you? You're more than they can handle. That's why they tried to silence you. Malik nodded, swallowing hard. Are they going to jail? We don't know yet, Marcus replied honestly. But we've pulled the curtain back. Everyone sees them now. Do you think they feel bad? That question hit different. Marcus stared at his son, the innocence in his eyes slowly fading into a deeper understanding of the world. Regret isn't justice, he said. Sometimes people feel sorry because they're caught. Not because they changed. The next day, the second half of the hearing began. This time, the room was packed. Not just with press and law enforcement, but with civilians who had flown in from other states. Victims of similar incidents. Families who had lost sons, daughters, husbands. The courtroom had become more than a legal venue, it was a battlefield of stories, and Marcus's was the fuse. The first to take the stand that day was Officer Sawyer. Sweating, stiff, and visibly rattled, he tried to maintain composure. His lawyer guided him through carefully rehearsed statements, crafted to paint the event as a tragic misunderstanding. But under cross-examination, Adrian dismantled him piece by piece. She showed inconsistencies in his timeline. Discrepancies in his report. She played audio clips where he contradicted his own narrative. The jury, now fully engaged, leaned in with narrowed eyes. Then came Bennett. Arrogant, but cracked. He tried to lean into legal jargon, standard operating procedure, field perception, imminent threat. But when Adrian pulled up the body cam clip again, the one where his voice was caught saying, "People like that don't belong here," the room froze. And this time, she didn't say a word. She let it play, then let the silence land hard. Marcus watched from the gallery, arms crossed, jaw set. No gloating. Just resolve. These men hadn't just attacked his son. They had tried to erase him. To reduce a family into a statistic. But now they were the ones exposed, stripped of excuses, shivering under the light of accountability. Then, unexpectedly, the judge asked if Marcus had anything further to add. It wasn't required. But the moment felt necessary. Marcus rose again, stepped into the space where the truth demanded voice, and spoke slowly. "I was trained to survive any battlefield," he said. "To identify threats, make quick decisions, protect those under my care. I've been to war zones where the enemy was clear. But here, in my own country, in front of my own house, I was powerless. Not because I lacked strength, but because the system was designed to silence me. Until now." He turned slightly, facing the officers. "You saw my son, and you didn't see a child. You saw a threat. You acted not with fear, but with entitlement. And you thought there would be no consequence. But justice doesn't always come with flashing lights or loud voices. Sometimes it moves quietly. Deliberately. Like now." The courtroom remained frozen in silence, the weight of his words pressing on everyone present. Even Judge Melton looked visibly moved. He dismissed the court for deliberation, and the next hours dragged like centuries. People milled around the hallway, voices hushed, the gravity of the moment written across every face. Marcus stayed close to Malik, who leaned against him, eyes wide, not scared but alert. Ready. Finally, the clerk appeared. Verdict time. Back in the courtroom, the jury filed in. The foreman stood. His voice didn't waver. "On the count of violation of federal civil rights under color of law, we find Officer Sawyer guilty. On the count of use of excessive force against a minor, we find Officer Bennett guilty." Murmurs broke out. Gasps. Then silence. The judge turned to the defendants. "You are hereby remanded into federal custody pending sentencing and further review under military oversight due to the invocation of special jurisdiction and breach of cross-agency trust. Court is adjourned." It was over. But not really. The trial had ended. The room had erupted into controlled chaos. But Marcus didn't smile. He stood slowly, turned to his son, and gently knelt down. "This won't erase what happened," he said quietly. "But it means they can't pretend it didn't." Malik nodded. His voice was small. "You didn't give up." Marcus stood and hugged him tight. "And I never will." But even as they walked out, hand in hand, past the cameras, the microphones, the crowds chanting their names, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. What they had done, what he had done, was not vengeance. It was a reset. A challenge. A demand for a new chapter. Because when they tried to silence him with humiliation, they woke something greater. And now, the world was watching. The courthouse stood quieter now, the air no longer vibrating with the static of press cameras or the murmurs of restless onlookers. The gavel had come down, the verdict had been read, and the storm Marcus had spent weeks navigating had finally struck its target. Yet the silence that followed wasn't relief, it was something heavier. The sound of a system recoiling from exposure, of a community holding its breath in the wake of long-awaited consequences. Marcus stood outside those doors, Malik at his side, watching the horizon not for threats but for what came next. Because justice wasn't a final moment, it was a ripple, and this ripple had only begun to reach the edges. In the days that followed, everything changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that made headlines. But in small, quiet shifts that signaled something deeper had been disturbed. The police department released a statement filled with corporate slick language, deep regret, commitment to reform, isolated incident. But beneath the polish, the damage was evident. Internal Affairs placed multiple senior officers on administrative leave. City council meetings turned into battlegrounds of public outcry. Protests grew larger but more organized, and not a single one ended in violence. Marcus watched it all from a distance, speaking rarely, choosing his words with precision whenever he did. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but that's exactly what he had become, not because he was louder, but because he had refused to back down. Adrian remained at the front lines of the legal aftermath. She fielded interviews, filed motions, and coordinated with federal teams now stationed within the Augusta Police Department to oversee restructuring. She called Marcus often, sometimes just to check in, other times to update him on new developments. A buried complaint resurfaced, a civil suit filed by another family, a city official suddenly resigning under pressure. "You started something that's moving faster than anyone expected," she told him one evening. They thought this would be another protest cycle. They didn't expect a blueprint. But for Marcus, the noise around the courtroom wasn't the part he struggled with. What consumed him was what happened behind his own front door. Malik had changed. The brightness in his eyes hadn't dimmed completely, but it had been reshaped into something more guarded. He asked different questions now, not about school or friends, but about justice, power, and identity. He wanted to understand the machine that had nearly crushed him. He asked his father if he believed things would actually change. Marcus didn't lie. He said, "Some things will. Others will resist. But what matters is that now, they know we're not afraid." Yet privately, Marcus carried his own questions, about what came next, about the line he'd walked, about whether the path he chose had done more than just hold people accountable. It had placed him on a stage, vulnerable to backlash, scrutiny, even retaliation. Late at night, after Malik had gone to bed, Marcus would sit by the window and watch the street, the shadows, the occasional patrol car creeping past. He wasn't paranoid, but he was alert. Because victory, in this country, often came with a target. He spoke once with Trevor again, over a secure call. They didn't talk about classified documents or legal loopholes. They talked about the cost. Trevor told him, "You did the right thing. But doing the right thing always comes with baggage. Just don't carry it alone." Marcus nodded but said little. He appreciated the sentiment, but he knew something most didn't: the burden wasn't just in the fight, it was in surviving after it. Knowing how to live in a world you had forced to look in the mirror. One evening, Adrian visited. No suits. No files. Just 2 cups of coffee and the kind of silence that friends earn. They sat on the porch, the sun dipping behind the rooftops, and for a long while, neither spoke. Eventually, she turned to him. "You've changed things, Marcus. But there's something you need to think about now. How much of you do you want to give to this?" He raised an eyebrow, not out of confusion, but caution. "You could lead something bigger," she continued. "Organizations are reaching out. Networks want to fund initiatives. People see you as someone who can build the next wave." He took a sip of coffee, then answered slowly. "And if I don't? Then you protect what you have. You go back to your life. You focus on Malik. But either way, this won't fade. You'll always be the man who made the city face itself." That night, the dilemma weighed on him. It wasn't about ego. It was about survival. He didn't crave leadership. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. But he understood momentum. He understood that moments like this didn't come often. He could step forward and shape it. Or he could retreat and hope someone else did. Neither choice was easy. One offered purpose. The other offered peace. And he wasn't sure which one scared him more. A week later, Marcus was invited to speak at a town hall forum. He didn't accept right away. The request came from a local youth organization, mostly high school kids, some of whom had marched outside the courthouse during the trial. Malik saw the email and said, "You should go. They want to hear from you." Marcus looked at his son, saw the quiet plea in his eyes. Not for attention, but for connection. For proof that what they'd endured meant something to someone else. He agreed. The gymnasium was full. Not packed with media, not stiff with officials. Just families, students, teachers. People who lived the weight of injustice every day without headlines to carry their stories. Marcus stood in front of them, no podium, just a circle of folding chairs. He didn't deliver a speech. He told a story. About a man who wanted nothing more than to protect his son. About a moment that tried to break them. About how systems don't fear anger, they fear organization. About what happens when silence turns into strategy. A girl raised her hand at the end. She was maybe 15. Wide eyes. Tight braids. "Did it change you?" she asked. Marcus paused, then nodded. "Yeah. It did. It made me see how much we carry that isn't ours. But it also made me see how much we can do when we stop waiting for permission to be seen." Afterward, people came up to shake his hand, hug him, share their stories. Not all of them were hopeful. Some were bitter. Some carried pain that wouldn't go away with one verdict. But in every voice, Marcus heard the same thing: relief. Not that the system had changed, but that someone had cracked it open just enough for others to follow. Back home, Malik watched the forum replay online. He didn't say much, but Marcus noticed the way he sat, straighter, steadier. The boy who had once trembled under the weight of a taser now looked more grounded than ever. And yet, for Marcus, the internal tug remained. There was still work to do. The officers hadn't been sentenced yet. The department restructuring was underway, but the resistance was starting to rise, quietly, through coded media narratives, through political murmurs. Whispers of overreach, of attacks on law enforcement. The backlash was beginning. Not loud, not obvious. But Marcus could feel it. And it presented a deeper question. How far was he willing to go? The courtroom battle had been won. But what came after, the real war, was slower, harder, more complex. It was a war against culture, against normalization, against the slow erosion of outrage. Because the system didn't always strike back with violence. Sometimes, it struck back with apathy. With time. With silence. And that was the real dilemma. Was Marcus ready to become a permanent voice? To give more of himself? To risk more, not just for Malik, but for others? Or would stepping back, rebuilding their quiet life, protecting their peace, be the wiser choice? He didn't have the answer yet. But one thing was clear: no matter what choice he made next, the ground had shifted. And the world was still watching. The days that followed Marcus's forum appearance moved in a strange rhythm, slow on the surface, but pulsing underneath with something urgent and undefined. The verdict had dropped like a stone into a lake, but the ripples weren't just circles, they were waves hitting parts of the city that had long gone untouched. Church groups began organizing forums, students launched podcasts dissecting the trial, and more families emerged with stories that bore haunting similarities to Marcus's. But even with the forward motion, Marcus could feel the resistance tightening. City officials who had praised the verdict in front of cameras now spoke with hesitation behind closed doors. Certain council members began pulling out of promised reform meetings. Marcus received letters, some filled with gratitude, others laced with passive threats wrapped in polite language. At the surface, the world was applauding him. But he knew enough about war to know the most dangerous part came after the noise, when enemies retreated not in surrender, but in strategy. One evening, as he closed the garage and locked the side gate, Malik stepped into the doorway with a look on his face that Marcus hadn't seen since before the trial, not fear, but uncertainty. "Can I ask you something?" the boy said softly. Marcus nodded and waved him inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp above the sink, casting long shadows on the tile. Malik fiddled with the hem of his hoodie before he finally spoke again. "Are we safe now?" It wasn't a dramatic question. There was no trembling in his voice. But it cut deeper than any scream could have. Marcus exhaled slowly, not wanting to rush the answer, not wanting to lie. He reached across the table and laid his hand over Malik's. "We're safer," he said carefully. "But safety isn't something that just appears. We have to build it. Every day." Malik looked up, his eyes searching for something beyond reassurance. "Do you ever wish we just stayed quiet? That none of this ever happened?" Marcus didn't flinch, but he took a long moment before responding. "Some nights, I wish you never had to carry this," he said. "That I could have shielded you from the whole thing. But if staying quiet means letting them win, then no. I don't wish that. Because we didn't just fight back. We made them look at us. Really look. And that's something they can't unsee." The phone rang just after midnight that same night. Adrienne's name flashed on the screen. Marcus answered with a quiet hello, expecting some late-breaking development or legal update, but her voice sounded different, tired, measured. "There's something you need to know," she said. "I just got a call from a journalist I trust. There's going to be a story dropping in the morning. One of the city officials is leaking a narrative. They're framing the tribunal process as a political stunt. They're saying the federal case was manipulated through illegal data access. They're trying to smear the evidence chain." Marcus's jaw clenched. "They're coming after the method now." "They're not questioning the truth," she replied. "They're questioning how we got it. They're planting doubt. Not directly. Through implication. And who's feeding it? Hard to say," she sighed. "But the pressure's mounting. There's talk of lawsuits, not against you, but against the process. If they can discredit the process, they don't need to disprove the facts." He thanked her, ended the call, and sat in silence for a long time. The attack wasn't physical. It wasn't loud. It was surgical, and Marcus recognized it instantly. Disinformation was one of the most effective weapons he'd seen used during foreign deployments. It didn't just challenge reality. It bent it. And it forced those who told the truth to spend their energy defending it instead of building from it. The next morning, the headline hit. "Legal procedure under fire in Augusta police trial, did the system overreach?" Marcus didn't react outwardly. He read the article slowly, parsing every line, every quote from anonymous sources, every carefully planted suggestion that the military angle had biased the outcome. The piece didn't deny what happened. It just made people question whether the justice delivered had followed the right path. That was all it took. He took Malik to school that morning like any other day. The car ride was quiet until they reached the corner. Before getting out, Malik turned and asked, "Is this about us?" Marcus nodded. "Indirectly. They want people to forget what really happened." Malik's jaw tightened. "But everyone saw it. They heard it. They know." "They saw it, yes," Marcus replied. "But sometimes, what they remember depends on what they're told afterward." He dropped Malik off, then drove not to the mechanic shop, but to a small coffeehouse near downtown where he'd arranged a meeting. Trevor was waiting inside, sitting in the back corner, his laptop open but screen dark. They shook hands, sat, and wasted no time. "They're running a precision smear," Marcus said. "I've seen this playbook. They don't fight the facts. They fight the context." Trevor nodded. "I know. And I've traced where it started. It's not just local. There's a consultancy group, quiet, expensive, politically connected. They specialize in narrative redirection. They've been used before in police PR damage control cases. So this is coordinated." "Yes. And they're good. They're not going to say you're lying. They're going to say your truth came from broken methods." Marcus leaned back. How do we counter it? You bring the light, Trevor said. Full transparency. Not just what happened in the courtroom. How you got the evidence. Why you did it the way you did. You show your integrity. Marcus rubbed his temples. So we fight narrative with narrative? No, Trevor said. We fight story with truth. But this time, you tell it on your terms. That night, Marcus sat with Adrian and crafted a public letter. Not a defense. Not an attack. Just clarity. He laid out the timeline, the methods, the reasons. He revealed the chain of legality behind every document. He attached copies of the communications showing cooperation between agencies. And he published it not through a press outlet, but directly to the public, through community forums, civil rights channels, schools, churches. The message wasn't framed in legal jargon. It was direct. Emotional. Human. And it worked. Not instantly. But within days, the smear piece was buried by a flood of personal testimonies. People who had watched the trial. Parents. Teachers. Youth leaders. Former officers. Victims. They flooded comment sections, letters to the editor, public spaces. They told the truth again, not from Marcus's voice, but from theirs. And that's when something shifted again. The consultancy group pulled back. The council members trying to distance themselves now found themselves being questioned by their own voters. And Marcus, once at the center of the storm, found a strange kind of stillness. Not because the battle was over, but because for the first time, he wasn't the only one holding the weight. One evening, while walking Malik through their neighborhood, now quieter, now more familiar, the boy looked up at his father and asked, "Do you think they regret it? The ones who hurt us?" Marcus thought for a long time. "Maybe," he said. "But whether they do or don't, doesn't change what we've done since." Malik nodded, eyes forward. Good. The world hadn't changed overnight. But something had undeniably cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked wide enough for light to get in. Marcus could feel the difference when people waved instead of crossing the street. When officers drove slower past his house. When a teenager at the gas station called out, "Thank you, sir," not with sarcasm, but with sincerity. The weight hadn't lifted. But it had shifted. From isolation to solidarity. From fear to awareness. And in that shift, Marcus saw the beginnings of something that no courtroom could guarantee: hope. The kind you don't buy with verdicts. The kind you build with time, voice, and endurance. And still, a question lingered in the back of his mind, quiet but persistent. Had this been enough? The evening sun painted the horizon in streaks of deep amber and muted gold as Marcus stood alone in his backyard, the cool air brushing against his skin with a quiet, deliberate stillness. The grass beneath his feet was slightly damp, the trees at the edge of the yard swaying gently, whispering stories only the wind could understand. It had been weeks since the courtroom victory, since the backlash and its retreat, since the letter he published had silenced whispers and reignited a conversation too long buried. But now, as the dust settled and the city adjusted to the weight of its own reflection, Marcus felt something else beginning to rise, a space, not quite peace, but possibility. And with it, the persistent feeling that something important still lingered unresolved, like a note held too long at the end of a song, waiting for release. Inside, Malik sat at the dining table with schoolbooks spread before him, his pencil tapping rhythmically as he stared at the open pages. Marcus watched from the window, noticing the focus in his son's eyes, but also the fatigue underneath it. Not physical tiredness, the kind of emotional wear that came from being seen in ways a child shouldn't be. Marcus stepped back into the house, grabbed 2 glasses of water, and sat across from him without a word. Malik glanced up, gave a small smile, and pushed his notebook aside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus asked gently, "How's school?" Malik shrugged. "It's okay. People don't really know what to say. Some treat me normal, some avoid me. Teachers ask too many questions, like they're afraid to say the wrong thing. One kid asked if I was gonna be famous now. He let out a dry laugh, but it didn't carry humor. Like that's something I ever wanted. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing every word. You don't have to be anything for anyone else. Not a symbol. Not a story. Just you. But that's the thing, Malik said, his voice lower now. I'm not just me anymore, am I? Everyone sees me as the kid from the video. The one who got tossed. And you? You're the man who took down the police. We can't go back to being regular. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but full of warmth. No, we can't. But we get to choose what this becomes. We didn't ask for it, but it found us. And we answered. That doesn't mean you lose who you are. It means you now have more reason to protect that person. Malik looked down at his hands. Do you ever wish you'd handled it differently? Marcus paused, then answered truthfully. I think about it. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet, taken the settlement, let them spin their version of the truth. Maybe we'd have peace, but it wouldn't be real. We'd still be carrying it, just quieter. And I've lived too long with silence pretending to be healing. Malik nodded slowly, absorbing that. So what now? That question lingered. What now? It was the question on everyone's mind, the media, the activists, the politicians. Some wanted Marcus to lead, to stand at the front of every protest, to build a foundation or run for office. Others wanted him to disappear, to take the win and fade into the background so the system could repair its image without his shadow looming over it. But Marcus didn't want any of that. He didn't want power, and he didn't crave recognition. What he wanted, what he'd always wanted, was to build a world where Malik could just be, where his son wouldn't have to carry the weight of survival in a place that treated his skin like a threat. The answer came a few days later, not through a speech or a headline, but through a visit from someone unexpected. Adrian knocked on the door late in the afternoon, her expression unreadable, her hands holding a folder thick with documents. Marcus let her in, offered her coffee, and waited as she sat down, exhaled slowly, and slid the folder toward him. I need to show you something, she said. It's a letter. From one of the officers. He opened it slowly, unfolding the handwritten pages. The handwriting was uneven, as if written under pressure or emotion. It was from Officer Sawyer. In it, he detailed a childhood shaped by a father in law enforcement, a belief system instilled in him that taught fear before understanding, superiority before humanity. He spoke of confusion, shame, guilt. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't justify what happened. He simply acknowledged it. In raw, broken words, he admitted that what they had done wasn't just wrong, it had been intentional. And that watching the trial, listening to Marcus speak, watching Malik sit beside him with such silent strength, had shattered something in him. He ended the letter with a single line, I don't expect to be forgiven, but I needed you to know I finally see it now. Marcus stared at the letter for a long time, hands unmoving, breath shallow. Adrian watched him with care, then spoke softly. You don't have to respond. And this doesn't erase what he did. But it changes something, doesn't it? He nodded, slowly folding the letter. It means it mattered. The next day, Marcus took Malik to a community center where they had been invited to speak, not as symbols, not as survivors, but as builders. The crowd was small, mostly teenagers, some parents, a few teachers. Marcus didn't prepare a speech. Instead, he shared a moment. He spoke about fear, about dignity, about what it means to stand in a room and be seen as a threat without ever having spoken. Malik stood beside him, and when asked if he wanted to say something, he simply said, I didn't know what power was until they tried to take it from me. And now I know it doesn't come from hurting someone else. It comes from being able to look at what hurt you, and decide you'll be more than it. The room went quiet. Some nodded. A few wiped tears. And in that silence, something began again. Not justice. Not yet. But truth. Carried forward, spoken without fear. That night, as they returned home, Marcus sat on the edge of Malik's bed while the boy pulled the blankets over himself. There was a peace in the room now that hadn't existed in months. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of something more powerful, understanding. Malik looked up, eyes barely open. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I'm proud of you too, son. More than you'll ever know." He stood, turned off the light, and paused at the doorway. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel watched. He felt free. 6 months later, Augusta looked different. Not in the skyline or the streets, but in the way people walked, in the way they listened, in the conversations being held in spaces that had long stayed silent. Something had shifted, not a revolution, not a miracle, but a recalibration. The police department had undergone a complete restructuring. A new chief was appointed, one with a background in both law enforcement and community work. Officers were now required to undergo regular civil rights training, psychological evaluations, and community immersion programs. The body cam policies were rewritten, and several oversight positions were filled by civilians, including local leaders and educators. One of those seats was offered to Marcus. And he declined. Instead, he created something of his own. A local initiative named the Front Porch Project, built to foster real conversations between youth and institutions. No staged panels, no filtered messaging, just dialogue, raw and necessary. It started small, one room, a few kids, a few volunteers. But quickly it grew into something larger, a platform that schools adopted, that other cities wanted to replicate, that national organizations began to notice. He didn't want to lead rallies. He wanted to build bridges. And he did, brick by brick, using the same patience and precision that once made him a force on the battlefield. Only this time, the mission wasn't destruction. It was restoration. Malik, now more grounded, began volunteering with the program after school. Not because Marcus asked him to, but because he felt called to. He found power in mentorship, in standing beside kids his age who were just beginning to understand what it meant to be seen differently, to walk into a room and wonder if they belonged. Malik didn't preach. He listened. He shared just enough of his story to remind others they weren't alone, then focused on helping them find their own. He started writing, quietly, filling journals with poetry and reflections and ideas for books he hadn't told anyone about. And one afternoon, sitting under a tree in the same yard where it all began, he turned to his father and said, "I think I want to be a teacher." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just smiled, the kind that said more than words ever could. And then he said, "Then you teach them everything they told you not to learn." Adrian continued her work on a broader scale, now serving as legal counsel for multiple advocacy organizations across the state. She remained in contact with Marcus, often calling to ask for insight or to loop him into initiatives that needed voices like his. But she respected his boundaries. She understood that his strength came not from spotlight, but from clarity. They met once a month for coffee, exchanged stories, laughed about the absurdity of politics, and sometimes sat in silence, both knowing how rare and sacred quiet truth had become. Officer Sawyer remained in federal custody. But something in his path shifted too. His letter had not gone unanswered. Marcus never visited him, never wrote back, but he ensured that the prison reform group, Voices from the Inside, received the letter and used it in their education work with incarcerated officers. Sawyer began participating in those sessions. Not as a victim, not as a martyr, but as a man trying to unlearn what had been poisoned into him. He never sought redemption. But he worked, quietly, to ensure the disease he once carried didn't spread unchecked to others. Officer Bennett, however, never changed. He fought the verdict, appealed every ruling, and lost. His sentence was longer. His name, now etched into legal history, became an example of what systemic rot looks like when it wears a badge. His fall was public, painful, and necessary. Not as vengeance, but as consequence. The city, once tight-lipped and slow to respond, now funded Marcus's initiative, hosted youth councils, and approved transparency laws that were previously considered too progressive. Change didn't erase the past, but it illuminated it. Made it impossible to ignore. And in that light, new possibilities grew. Marcus, for the first time in years, allowed himself to exhale. Not because the fight was over, but because he had found a new way to carry it. He'd built something from the ashes, not for recognition, not for validation, but for the future, not just for Malik, but for every kid who had been told to shrink in the face of power. He had not been broken. He had been reborn into something stronger than his silence and more enduring than his scars. And so now we look at this story, not as a tale of revenge, but of reckoning. Not a spectacle of pain, but a journey through it towards something deeper. We watched a man stripped of his dignity on the front lawn of his own home turn his pain into precision. We saw a boy learn too early what fear looks like when it wears a uniform. And we witnessed the power of quiet resistance, the kind that doesn't shout, but builds. That doesn't destroy, but reclaims. So now, I ask you. What would you have done? If your child was hurt not by criminals, but by those who swore to protect him? If the system handed you silence and called it justice? Would you break? Would you fight? Would you choose to build something no one else could imagine? Let us know in the comments. What did this story awaken in you? And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think, question, remember, or hope, then don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist, where stories challenge the way we see the world, one truth at a time. Until next time. Stay aware. Stay grounded. And never forget the power of your own voice.